lassù in montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. C'è per dire lassù in montagna, sotto l'ombra di un vecchio.
I may have missed the best opportunity for this, but that's because I was in the process of moving and setting up. But here we are finally, an Irish tale to tell you. There's this weird obsession with Leif Erikson and Scandinavians being the first supposed Europeans to land in North America, or in America as a whole. Yet they tend to completely forget or ignore the arrival about 500 years earlier of an Irishman by the name of St.Brendan. A lot of this is based on a book called Brendan the Navigator by Dr. George A. Little, published in 1945. But I will put other sources that I used in the description as well. My main reason for using this book, however, mostly, is because Little does a really good job of setting the context and the background of St. Brendan. Before I fully go into the story, however, I will discuss some of the issues with the accounts and some of the substantial reasons some historians have had their doubts. But I will say I have noticed an odd hesitation towards this compared to the Nordic sailors and their journeys. I won't say anything right now, but it's a bit sus when they don't give any reasons for their doubts. A common issue with some accounts is that they either combine or mix Brendan's two major journeys, one mostly around the Faroe Islands and reaching Iceland, while the other one we'll be discussing is the one around Newfoundland and the Caribbean. Similarly, some accounts might have mixed metaphors or comparisons to legends with the journey or story itself. There's also the possible issue that some of the written accounts are copies that have been made of older accounts that may have been lost due to damage or other issues, which, although helpful, means it's difficult to confirm if everything was copied correctly or if anything was changed in the process of copying. Furthermore, there is also the issue that the crew would have been subject to exhaustion, fatigue, periods of long hunger and thirst, causing possible hallucinations, which explains some of the more fanciful parts. As we'll get on to later, when they made landings in America, they would think that these places were more like islands, or even if larger islands particularly, as opposed to, per se, an entire continent. Now the 500s and 400s in Ireland were very different from most of mainland Europe, let alone the depictions from colonial propaganda later on. While Ireland still had its own complicated intrigue and wars, it was not as tumultuous as mainland Europe at this time. There are many reasons for this I could get into, but it's this more comparable, placid period that would be significant to Ireland entering and creating the foundations for its golden age. Mainland Europe would be ravaged by both Justinian's last-ditch campaign to restore the Roman Empire, and the Goths invading and fighting with the Roman Empire, causing more destruction to Europe as a whole. The plague had also hit Europe, known as the Justinian Plague, around 541 AD, while also a shift in the climate due to an enormous volcano eruption in 536 AD, which would cause crop devastation on a global scale and many other issues. Later on, I will mention these destructive forces further on their influences, but let us focus more on Ireland. Ireland would have several universities founded, and were actually free. Even though its students mostly consisted of the upper class, they did produce many scholars and well-educated people. Although Ireland was still having the last remnants of conflicts between Catholics and Druids, there was the beginning of assimilation of these religions, which provided an interesting presence of former Druid priests becoming Catholic priests. This would create many interesting results, but of most importance to this video is that Druids for centuries had been experts in celestial navigation and the study of stars in general. These former Druid priests, having also been educated in Christian theology, would not only be extremely well educated in theology, but also in knowledge gathered from other parts of the world that were within Christendom at the time. This is extremely relevant to St. Brendan and his education in becoming a navigator. St. Brendan was not only taught at theological university, but his teacher, Bishop Eric, was one of these former Druid priests as mentioned before. Interestingly, one of St. Brendan's relatives, known as Virgilius the Geometer, or his original name, Virgil, would, after Brendan's death, be one of the first to present the theory of antipodes and that the earth was round. This gives us some understanding of St. Brendan's education and his understanding of the geographical world of his time. Now, I won't go into too much detail about his first journey around the Faroe Islands, but I may make some comparisons, as from this first journey, he would learn lessons to apply to his next journey. His foster mother, Ita, was influential in his learning from this, particularly in a theological regard. However, she would also advise him to take a form of rudder and have a vessel constructed of mostly wood, rather than his curragh of wicker, some wood, and hides as he did before. But what did this ship look like, and what was its composition? The ship was made of mostly wood, likely oak, with a deck supported by stanchions or pillars, and was tar-caulked with pitch. It had smithwork done on the hull, with strakes held together with iron clinched about 2 inches long that had rounded heads on the outside, and riveted over diamond-shaped iron rows on the inside. The reason I'm specific on this is because some later ships would apparently do the reverse for this. The anchor was made of iron with a tightly woven rope holding it to the ship, and a single pine sapling mast held the sail made of woven materials, unlike the sail of his earlier curragh that had been made of hides mostly. It had storage over and above that held seeds and grain. Its storage also included several casks and water skins, tools, and other supplies for repairs, and also live pigs for food. This also included plants that might be useful on the voyage, particularly for scurvy, it's noted. He also thought to bring 3 trained ravens in order to find land when necessary. It had a crew of 60 men, of mostly priests and of course navigators and sailors. Some of the priests and monks themselves were also both navigators and sailors, much like St. Brendan. However, the crew also consisted of many other trades, such as jurists, writers, ship, house, and mill builders, wood carvers, charcoal burners, leather workers, fishermen, smiths, and other metal workers. On the 22nd of March 551 AD, St. Brendan and his crew set sail from east of Arranmore for his second voyage into the unknown for them at that time. About 40 days later, they came across an iceberg, which they had never seen before. From their description of it, Little and others determined that the iceberg had drifted from the Arctic into warmer waters, allowing us to identify that they had not gone too far north in the Atlantic Ocean. They would observe it for about 3 days before leaving it as it melted away. A while after, they would make landfall and come across walruses. From this, the iceberg, and the description of the cliff formations and the number of days from the accounts, Little concludes that this most likely would be Newfoundland in modern-day Canada. Although this would be the first time Europeans landed in North America, this was a very short affair, as they quickly believed it best to avoid these creatures and to coast the landmass they had encountered by following birds. Tragically, not long after leaving Newfoundland, their crewmate Crosson became very sick and died. This event is significant in not only that it is the first European to be laid in North American waters, or American waters in general, but also the first recorded Christian burial at sea. After laying him to rest, they headed southeast, during which they encountered a waterspout. Much later, though, they would land at a reef that is believed to be in the Bahamas, more specifically the Sponge Isles. This is when we have our first encounter between Europeans and Native Americans that George Little claims might be the Arawaks, who Columbus would encounter as well. According to the accounts, the Arawaks appeared to be hostile and possibly threatening the crew. This is possibly one of the most momentous events of this journey, especially considering the later tragedies that other Europeans would cause and bring. St. Brendan, seeing this, told his crew not to go to shore, for
they would be forced to fight, and to spill human blood was not their business.
Little notes this also as significant in that both later arrivals of Scandinavians and Christopher Columbus would not understand this decision. He also notes that St. Brendan's crew likely could have been able to fight decently due to their endurance and fighting capabilities some had back in Ireland. It really shows how there had been the ability to recognize Native Americans as people. Therefore, the excuses that the way the colonizers treated these people is in some way reflective of being men of their time is actually quite lacking. I'll get into the real reasons in a moment, but first let's continue. This is what I had mentioned earlier about the destructive forces affecting Europe at this time, which might have influenced St. Brendan and his response. These forces could have resulted in a want of peace, and not to start further conflict and destruction as seen in Europe at this time. There's also the fact that Ireland had only recently begun to be converted to Catholicism, and with that came an understanding of humanity of those of different beliefs. To Brendan, this must have been also a significant thought, as his teacher Urk was a former Druid. This isn't even mentioning that the universities in Ireland had also seen students from elsewhere in Europe, which may have also have impacted St. Brendan's views on others. Also could have meant he just wasn't a big asshole. They would wait for 7 days there while they made some repairs and renewed their rigging. However, when they went to set sail, their anchor had become stuck in a coral fissure, and so they had to cut the anchor free to set off. A while after setting sail, they came across another island. This was likely the main island of the Bahamas. They would describe a fish which had left the seashore and were confined in enclosures and in cashel, which sound very similar to turtles. Once they had departed a little ways from the shore, a shark began to circle their ship. You can imagine how concerning this would be. A great ray is believed to have been the creature which they described to have driven off the shark. From here they would set sail westward, finding land again 8 days later. This they called the land of Promise of Saints, or in Irish Gaelic, Tir Targe. This would later be known as Florida. They would spend 40 days exploring the local area and would set up camp at a wide river that little believes it possibly the St. John's River, while some speculate it could have been even the Mississippi waterway. After a few days camping, a Native American man, possibly from the Shawnee tribe, arrived at their camp and had a conversation with St. Brendan. There are some accounts that describe the Native American as an angel, telling him to return instead. From these conversations, it was decided that they should return to their ship. Having returned to their boat, though, they would camp by it for a while they decided whether or not to head home. In the year 553 AD, they would leave back home to Ireland. Around 2 years had been spent on this voyage, although they were able to more safely return due to their navigation skills of St. Brendan and his crew. So why am I talking about this? I think it's very interesting in this story that there's this recognition of Native Americans as humans and the interactions in which violence is avoided. It also really shows that the interactions and meetings between Europeans and Native Americans did not have to be violent in the first place, and therefore likely convenient not to discuss, as it would disprove this idea that colonization was natural. I think it would be fair to say that the biggest contrast in these interactions was in part due to their reasoning for their journeys. St. Brendan's reasons were mostly to follow the ways and winds of God, unlike those of the Scandinavians and Columbus, who had intended to establish some form of colonies. I recently have decided to change my schedule to try to put out a video every other week, as uni is going to ramp up for me, and I hope this extra time will give me more time to do more in-depth research. If you like this video, hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more content from me, obviously hit the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications.